Кембридждээс шүү дээ. Тий. Тий, намайг PhD хийхэд манай чинь Oyun undergraduate. Тэгэл Америк ихтэй амар мундаг охин байсан шүү дээ.
Би сая Нью-Йоркт тэмцсэн. Do you need to see this stuff? Яг сургуулиуд үзчихэж яг дарьяашаг
ажиллаж байна уу? Нью-Йоркт ажиллаж байна уу?
Нью-Йоркт ажиллаж байгаа тэмцсэн. Philadelphia музей багштаа ажиллаж.
Одоо чи тэгээ Лондонд чи 1 жил үү?
Тийм, London School of Economics.
Тэгээ дараа нь яах вэ?
Магистрат чи дараа нь PhD сурах юм.
Yeah, because the thing, what we're doing is, it's eye contact, and you're like really close to the lens, so you can't move into it. You gotta stay.
So can I just move my chair?
No.
All right.
Just lean to the left.
Okay.
That's it. There you go. We're rolling. Go ahead.
Okay, what happens? I'm sorry.
Okay, so you can introduce yourself, and if you could just state your name to you, introduce yourself.
Okay, that's just for the record, is it?
Exactly.
Okay. Zorig Oyun, member of the parliament, born 1964. What else?
If you could also state your title, what's you're a member of parliament, and you're also a director of...
All right, okay. I'm head of the Zorig Foundation, and I've been member of the parliament since 1998. And this year I've been re-elected again by a professional meteorologist.
I've got room all the way up. It's okay.
Зүгээр яг одоо чиний хувьд бол conscious сознательно юу хийх хэрэгтэй л шийдвэр. Яг индастри руу явах гэж эсвэл яг тэр development руу шууд нөө практик руу орох уу? Тэгэхээр та
development руу шууд практик руу орох жоохон сонирхолтой байгаа.
Okay, and also feel free to smile too. It's very serious what we're talking about, but we do want to see you smile. You have a wonderful face.
Okay, thank you.
And also, when Tuya or I ask you a question, because they won't hear our voice on tape, you need to repeat half the question. In other words, if we say, how do you feel about this? You would say, well, the way I feel about this is...
Right.
So you repeat half.
Okay.
Do you ask
You're wrong.
Okay, about the name and all that is taken?
No, we got that.
Yeah, we have, okay. Please tell us about 1990 demonstrations and hunger strikes. What did you do then, and how did you feel about it?
Right. The first demonstration took place in December 1989, and that was on the 10th of December, which is the International Day for Human Rights. And there weren't many people during that demonstration. I think about 200 or 300. And maybe 100 of those 300 were maybe from the sort of Mongolian KGB. Anyway, and then from January on, almost every Sunday, or every second Sunday, demonstrations were taking place mostly in the main Sukhbatar Square in Ulaanbaatar, and the number of people have been growing and growing. And I myself didn't go to all the demonstrations because my brother, Zorig, he was one of the main leaders of the pro-democracy movement. So I tried to help him with other things like doing work at home, looking after my mom, and maybe translating some things for him into English. And the tension or the demands of the pro-democracy young people have been increasing with every demonstration. And during January 1990, a lot of international journalists and international press started coming, most of them from Beijing offices, and in disguise as being tourists, because all taking tourist visas, but not in disguise. And so it was becoming interesting, at the same time tense.
How did your brother Zorig become involved in the pro-democracy movement?
Right, Zorig graduated from a Moscow university. He studied so-called scientific communism. That was the subject which was taught those days in Russia and also in Mongolia as well. So he graduated from the main Moscow State University in 1995. So he wasn't only studying this communism, but at the same time, of course, he was studying philosophy, history, and all these things which were combined in this subject. And I think starting from those days, he started maybe comparing various options of, well, as I said, it wasn't only the communism they learned, but also they probably learned about bad sides of imperialism or capitalism or various things from history. And I remember when he came back from Moscow, even when the Gorbachev era hadn't started yet, sometime in 86 or 87, he was saying, okay, I want to establish a new political party, which is a completely new thing during those days. And you know, during the one of the good things of socialism, I think, was that it gave us a lot of feeling of patriotism. We all wanted to do something good for our country or for Mongolia. And I think from some of my brother's letters during those days, he was always worried about the state we are in, and he always wanted to improve the situation in Mongolia. And I think from his early days, he wanted to make the country more open, more democratic, and that's, I think, how he got involved in democratic movement. But at the end of '98, he started a PhD at the Mongolian State University, and his subject was transforming political system of Mongolia. He has never finished his PhD, but I think in practice he's done a lot to transform the political system of Mongolia. And while he was at the State University, a lot of young people started gathering in his room, and of course it wasn't only it didn't start only in Mongolia. It was the democratic changes started, and this perestroika time started in Russia and other Eastern European countries. So I think, and so the young people started being affected by that move.
Do you need any water because you're swallowing? You seem like you need something to drink. Are you okay?
Okay, fine.
Yeah. Just
Ready?
Okay, I'm going to ask about your brother Zorig again. Why did he dedicate his life to the Mongolian democratic movement and to Mongolian democracy in general?
Well, I think Zorig, my brother, he wanted to improve life in Mongolia in general. And he thought that making Mongolia democratic, or changing Mongolia into a democratic state, is the path to bettering lives of people. So that's why I think he dedicated his life to democracy. And I remember from his letters when he was a student, he always wanted to improve life in Mongolia. He was always concerned what the situation was like in Mongolia. And I remember he was saying, well, look at how lives of people are like, for example, in Japan or in some Western countries, and why can't we live the same way as these people? So I think he dedicated his life to democracy because he thought that was the path to improve lives of people.
What kind of specific improvements did he want?
Well, to start with, of course, freedom of speech, freedom of travel. You know, during the socialist times, it was a very restricted sort of life when Mongolia, plus Russia and some Eastern European countries, that was almost the whole world for us. And we didn't have any information about, well, not much information about any other country, so we couldn't travel outside that. So it was a very isolated life. So to start with, we wanted to open up, we wanted to have at least the opportunities to have this whole world for us and not only part of the world.
If I can interrupt.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you actually talk about during that time? What were people talking about? What was the feeling at that time? Was there a feeling of hope? Or is it unsure? Were people didn't know what was going to happen? Or?
I think people were quite optimistic, and they did hope that there will be a change, because there were examples of other what's been happening in other countries, or former socialist countries, like Czechoslovakia or Poland or Hungary. Things have started changing there. Similarly in Russia, and because it could change there, we hoped that we could change things in Mongolia as well. Although if you take that Mongolia is a Central Asian country or an Asian country, there was no guarantee, of course, because it's, again, not Eastern Europe, where Eastern Europe was exposed to other Western countries to a certain degree, and people could get a lot of information in Eastern Europe. So it was a slightly different situation. But we did, yeah, of course there was a bit of fear at the same time, and on the other hand it was very exciting, and we were hoping that things will change.
So how did the people see the future of Mongolia?
How did they see it in 1990? I don't think people had a very clear idea of what society they will live in or they want to live in. They knew that they knew a bit about democratic principles, and they knew, okay, people in some democratic and developed countries have better life standards. On the other hand, there was a lot of information about huge unemployment, crime and other problems in Western countries. So it's what people wanted to see as a how people
how they wanted to picture Mongolia under
in future,
democracy.
right?
And
Yeah,
go ahead.
sorry. What do you think people envisioned for their future in Mongolia?
Mhm.
Was there, you talk about them being uncertain and being afraid. Was there real fear there? Was there real threat to what you were doing? Were you endangering yourselves? Do you think Mongolian people were endangering themselves as well by going through this,
Mm-hmm.
by doing these things?
I think, yes, I think there was a danger that there could be a clash or violence, like, for example, in Romania. There were, okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So, again,
Right, with a danger.
yeah.
Just risk factors, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
What were the risk factors?
I think there was a risk that there will be a clash. There could be a clash. Sorry. I think there was a risk and there was a danger. For example, during one demonstration in April, the then the communist government decided to put soldiers, an army outside the government house, opposing the big crowd of people. And for example, Zorig, my brother, he was one of the people who stood on two guys' shoulders and was shouting to the crowd, "Be calm, and we don't want any violence, we don't want any clash." And people did obey him. Everybody, thousands and thousands of people in the square, they just sat on the floor. And I think both sides, both the demonstrators and the government, could find this peaceful or non-violent solution. And during those demonstrations, of course, a lot of negotiations were taking place between the government people and between the democratic leaders. And because so many things depend on personalities, on people themselves, I think those who represented both sides could be wise enough not to clash. Because, for example, if one of the leaders in the government or in the democratic, on the democratic side, were of some violent nature, I don't know, or wasn't very wise, one couldn't predict, of course, the consequences, like in some countries.
So what did then the government want to realize? What were their hopes, and what were they realized? Were their hopes realized? What the people and the government at that time?
First of all, the government, or then the Communist Politburo, they decided to resign en masse. But it wasn't that easy. There was a hunger strike, a few days hunger strike, and as I said, the negotiations in between. And the first thing the democratic movement could achieve was that the then Communist Party agreed to have allow a multi-party system. They allowed people to create their political parties, and they also called for the first democratic elections in June of that year. So the pro-democracy demonstration started more or less in January, and then already at the end of June, in just 6 months, we could have our first democratic free elections. And that's after almost 70 years of socialist rule. So that, I think that was an amazing achievement.
And what was in manifesto, in democratic manifesto?
One of the basic things in the democratic manifesto was we don't want one-party rule. We don't want Politburo to tell us what to do all the time. We want freedom of press, and we want freedom to travel, to say what we want. And they were also calling for for allowing private entrepreneurship, private businesses. I think these were the main things they were asking to start with. But I think at the beginning of the democratic movement, including my brother, some democratic leaders were hoping for some better type of socialism. I remember when they were holding their first press conferences, they were saying, well, we think the socialism we're having now is not the right socialism. There could be some better type of socialism, and it's some sort of deviated type of socialism. And it wasn't only their naivety, but I think it was partly their tactics. So that if you start putting your objectives straight away, it could have been quite a big shock to the communist leadership, and they couldn't have been probably as flexible as they were. So step by step, they were moving forward with their demands, I think, the Democratic Coalition.
So did they first want sort of a better socialism and then move towards democracy? Or what were specifics of that socialism?
Actually, when they were saying it in January, it was rather vague what they wanted by this better socialism, but they gave it up very soon. And so, as I say, maybe it was their tactics, more tactics rather than their real objectives.
If you could talk to people in the West about the years before this happened, about communist socialist years, because Americans have very clear definitions as to what they think communism and socialism is, and it's very different from what it's like here. What would you tell people in the West about what life was like before this happened?
Right. Okay. In 1990, I was 25 years old. So my life under socialism was my childhood, then this early young ages, and generally we had quite a comfortable, quite peaceful, and quite a happy childhood. And we didn't suffer. We had our clothing, food. We went, of course, everybody went to school, and it was rather peaceful environment. So when I think of my childhood under socialism, I have more good memories than bad memories. Of course, there were problems like we had to queue for meat all the time, or there wasn't enough. There weren't that many nice or good clothes, and of course, more importantly, there was very little information about the outside world. It was a very restricted environment, very isolated environment. It was Mongolia, Russia, a bit of information about Eastern Europe, and that was almost the whole world for us. And even if we got information about other countries than the socialist countries, it wasn't probably the realistic or real information. So I think that was one of the bad sides of those days, and this limited space and limited opportunities. But of course, when you're inside this limited space, you don't realize what other opportunities you have. So you are not necessarily unhappy. And I think a lot of kids were rather happy with the environment they lived in. And only when you, for example, I went to Czechoslovakia to do my first degree. That was in 1991. And only when I left Mongolia and Eastern Europe was still socialist, but it was also a different part of the world, and you could get more information about the outside world, and only then you start putting some questions and questioning your own system or the environment you lived in. So I think under the socialism, it was relatively happy, but limited life or limited environment.
So what did you think of the socialist regime then?
About socialist regime?
Well, you said that it was your childhood years.
Mm-hmm.
But you said that you were happy, but what did you think, and what do you think now?
And also, or rather, what do you think, and how did you eventually get involved with what your brother was doing?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, of course, although there was very limited information, it was information which was only given by the information which the Communist Party chose to give to people. We did know that, sorry.
You can start over.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Will the fascism with Союза?
Социализмын үеийн талаар та юу гэж боддог вэ?
Тийм. Социалист режимийн талаар тийм.
Одоо та юу гэж бодож байгаа вэ?
You're doing very well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Bossen, sorry. Right. So,
Just picking up quiet.
So the socialist regime, we knew that there are different other Western countries or other countries which have better system, as it were. As I said, during the socialist regime, we weren't that unhappy, but of course we remembered that during all these 70 years of socialism, there were a lot of negative things like purges in the 30s. For example, my own two grandfathers.
Can you start that one more time? Sorry, we had a noise. Yeah.
All right, okay.
So you can
That's
start.
okay, right.
Yes.
Right before you said, for example.
Yeah, purges.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah,
Mhm.
for example.
Right.
There.
For example, there were purges in the 1990s when tens of thousands of people were killed or repressed. We still don't know even the whole number of those that were repressed. And my own two grandfathers were one taken to a gulag to Russia and another died in prison. And so we, of course, remembered that. And also, we...
I think you said in the 1990s.
Yeah, I wanted to say. You said 19.
Purges.
Yeah, you said.
Oh, right, okay, I meant 30s.
Yeah.
Right, okay, I'll start again.
And also, if you can preface it, you prefaced it somehow.
Mhm.
And then you said, for example, and we didn't get that preface.
Yeah,
Right.
she said there were negative sides to
Okay.
Yeah.
to communism as well, and
Mhm.
for example, there were purges of 1930s.
Okay. So, the socialist regime, as I said, of course, we weren't that unhappy under the socialist regime, but we knew that we could have better lives or better system just by a little information we could get during those days. And of course, there were a lot of negative sides and negative memories during those 70 years of socialism that we had in Mongolia. Like, for example, purges in 1930s, when tens of thousands of people were killed or repressed, and we still don't know the exact whole number of those people. My two grandfathers, one was taken to Gulag to Russia and died there, and one died in prison in Mongolia. And also, of course, nobody wanted to be under one party rule when Politburo decided on almost everything. For example, my mother, she was asked to go to a training course in New Zealand by WHO. She was a doctor. And of course, they wouldn't be allowed to go to New Zealand. And the Mongolian government decided, okay, they're going to go to Poland instead. And there was another problem afterwards, because she is not a pure Mongolian, she's half Russian, half Mongolian. Because she didn't look completely Mongolian, it was the Central Committee of the Communist Party, or we call it Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, Central Committee of the MPRP, who could decide whether my mother could go or not. And of course, nobody wants to have such unfree life. And these were one of the basic things why people wanted to change Mongolia.
What do you think now about the socialist regime? And if you could talk a little bit more about the present MPRP leadership, sort of
Right.
the government, and why is it different from what it was before?
Of course, now everybody, well, almost everybody in Mongolia realizes that the socialist, the communist regime couldn't go on for much longer. And last year, Zorig Foundation conducted an essay competition among young people and adult people on what they think about democracy in Mongolia. And about 95% of all respondents said that the path we chose, the democracy and market economy path, was the right one. So nobody probably doubts in Mongolia that the democratic changes were the right changes, and this move towards from the socialist regime to democracy and market economy was the right decision. of course, there are a lot of problems with the current transition period, and a lot of people still live, that their life standards hasn't improved during those 10 years, and there are lots of other problems like rising crime, but these are, I think, the transition problems. But overall, sort of in principle, people agreed that that was a very good and very correct move. What was the next question? Sorry.
Well, the next question.
No, I haven't finished. I think that you just said that.
Yeah. Well, what kind of government do you?
About the current MPRP.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Well, if you could just describe what that is,
But yeah.
briefly to people.
Right.
If you could just describe what that party is.
Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party.
No. Well, why? I mean, well, not why. I mean, now the MPRP is in leadership of
Yes.
the government, and how is it different from what we had during the communist times?
Right. Right.
Because it is the same party, but
Yes.
we just want to know how is it different now, and just talk a little bit more about the present Mongolian government,
Right.
the whole government.
And if you could say it's the same party, but it's changed because we don't know.
Yes. Right. Okay. Sorry. Right. In 1990, Mongolia introduced multi-party system, and when there were the first free democratic elections, there was Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, or what we call the old ex-communist party, and other new democratic parties, and until 1996, MPRP still ruled the country. Although they have, of course, started changing its policies and its main objectives. They, from 1990, MPRP allowed this multi-party system. In 1992, we adopted a new Mongolian constitution, which allows the main basic human rights and also accepts main democratic principles and rights. So MPRP is no longer the same MPRP which it used to be during the socialist times. It has been renovating itself, but of course with like any old thing like with anything, you get this old mentality of some old members of that party, and you get new fresh people, new fresh blood who want to change the party. And as I said, 95% of, well, or even probably more, most people in Mongolia accept the democracy and market economy system, which means that a lot of MPRP members also accept that. So, from 1996, it's just Heather. I don't know how much information you will give in the background, but I can just talk and you can cut off.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah, you're doing well.
Fine.
Feel free to smile too.
From 1996 till 2000, this year, June elections, democratic parties created a coalition called Democratic Coalition, and they ruled the country. And again, in July this year, 2000, we held another parliamentary elections, and Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party won again. But MPRP, as I said, is no longer the same communist party as it used to be before 1990. The unfortunate thing with the results of this election is that more than 90% of all the seats went to one party, MPRP, which means there is not a proper opposition at all. So there's very disbalance in the parliament. So there will be a lot of problems of checks and balances. So now I think a lot of emphasis should be put on free media, on efforts of civil society, and those few seats, opposition seats in the parliament also, it's not only 4 seats in the parliament, they also represent 3 main opposition parties with tens and tens of thousands members behind them. So it will be very important, as I said, free media, civil society, and those opposition parties working with NGO, civil society and private sector, and offering some alternative policies and alternative decisions.
I just want to ask you about monitoring agencies as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do the four main opposition parties that were elected, do they work with the various monitoring agencies that sort of create checks and balances system for the government?
Манай барагтын байхгүй шүү дээ. Мониторинг гэсэн. Okay. Нөө чи юу яадаг? Засгийн газрыг хяндаг тийм. Okay. Right. Mm-hmm. Well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And again, feel free to smile.
Okay, fine. Right. With the monitoring bodies, unfortunately, we don't have in Mongolia many monitoring bodies yet. You know, we had the democracy only for 10 years, so we're just setting up democratic institutions. And before these elections, between 1996 till 2000, there was quite a strong opposition. It was this democratic ruling coalition, then opposition of MPRP, and opposition was quite an effective check on monitoring. They quite effectively could check the ruling government. But now I think a lot of effort should be put into creating these monitoring bodies, because there is such a big majority in the parliament of one.
Well, it's just that more than 95% of the Mongolian people accept democratic changes and think that Mongolia is a democracy now. Do you think that Mongolia is a democracy now? And if you do, why do you think so?
Right. Well, we can't say. Sorry. Right. Do I think?
I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Can you take a drink again?
No, I'm.
Okay.
Right. Is Mongolia democracy now? I think if you take political freedoms, some human rights issues, I think Mongolia has becoming more democratic. If you take economic freedoms, there is still a lot to do to achieve this democratic state, I think. If you take political freedoms like freedom of speech, or freedom of gathering and creating political parties, because both are there, or freedom of travel, or freedom to vote, of course. We've had fair and free democratic elections since 1990, and although this year, during these elections in year 2000, almost 90% of all the seats in the parliament went to one party, nobody can blame that it wasn't democratic. One can blame probably, for example, the election system. It's the first past the post and it's not proportional. One can blame these things, or one can blame, for example, the democratic coalition didn't have enough experience to get enough support from public. But nobody can blame or claim that the elections were not free. So I think in this respect, Mongolia is becoming more and more democratic. With respect to economic rights or human right to develop itself or himself, there is still a lot to do, because although we have a lot of political freedom, probably, especially in the countryside, there is a question: are people better off today than 10 years ago, or not? And I've been asking these questions for the last year and a half or 2 years, because we've had this democracy or market economy for about 10 years. And of course, at the beginning of the 1990s, a lot of people realized the transition period will be difficult. We have probably tightened our belts, as we say. But nobody was expecting that these hardships of transition will carry on for so long, for more than 10 years. And things in the capital, in Ulaanbaatar, have been improving, of course. But in the countryside, especially in some provincial centers, there used to be some industries, some factories, and most of them have collapsed. They can't compete during this market economy conditions because those provincial centers were more or less artificially created during the socialist times. And they have a very hard time to survive now. So there is a huge unemployment in those provincial centers. And because life for them, for those people, haven't improved in the last 10 years, they don't know why they should improve in the next 10 years. So there is some sort of, some feeling of uncertainty. And the question why our lives, or life of an average person, hasn't improved in the last 10 years, should be put to the governments in the last 10 years, I think. Of course, there were subjective reasons why life hasn't improved, but of course there were objective reasons why life hasn't improved. But I think there were also subjective reasons, like wrong decisions from our governments. But if you take all post-communist countries, if you take the former socialist countries, of course nobody in those countries, or nobody in Russia or in Mongolia, and all those international agencies like IMF or World Bank, whoever was helping those transition countries to recover, nobody knew how to change the system, how to, what were the best ways of improving economy, because it was never done before, of course. And I think there were a lot of achievements, but a lot of mistakes. And of course this transition period creates a lot of soil and opportunities for bad governors or bad decision makers, because you change everything. You change laws, you change institutions, you change mentality of the people. Oh, well, you don't change, but laws change, institutions change, and the mentality of people changes. And because there is no, and 10 years is a very, very short time to change a whole system and all these things into a different thing. And some other countries probably needed hundreds of years to do that. So with this transition time and with these opportunities, which could be both good but also bad, because you could use this lack of laws or lack of institutions, use for your own benefit, which a lot of people, not only in Mongolia, but for example in Russia and other former Soviet Union countries, used to benefit themselves, to enrich themselves. And there you go with a lot of corruption and a lot of abuse of power in the current transition countries. And I think it's a very, very dangerous thing. You can't assume that things will improve automatically. You can't assume just by taking democracy and just by accepting market economy, lives will improve or things will go to the better. I think people have to try very hard themselves to improve things or to check and balance the government, because there are also a lot of examples in history that just by the virtue that some evil people were in power, that destroyed a lot of other people. And I know a saying I like very much a saying by Plato, who apparently said, if good people don't want to go into politics, they should be prepared to be governed by bad people. So I think this motto, or this saying, should be remembered by a lot of people in transition periods now, and for example in Mongolia, because a lot of people start losing trust in government, in politics, and they say, oh, there is no, it's almost senseless to go into politics, to get involved with politics. We'll just leave it to, it's all dirty political game anyway. No, you can't do that, especially in periods like, in the transition periods like now. You have to be very, very careful.
Do you think that Mongolians think that they're better off now?
Mongolians, certain layers of Mongolians, so I mean,
certain lifestyles.
No, certain social levels.
So,
Society
right.
levels, classes.
Yeah.
Well, classes.
and okay.
Certain levels of
Okay.
society.
Okay,
Right.
try to keep it concise.
right.
Okay.
Certain people are better off. Certain social class, well, I can't say social classes, okay, I'll start again.
And if you could practice it, I think that.
Right, okay. I think that, for example, if I look at myself or my classmates, we're better off. We graduated from a good school during the socialist times, and we lived in Ulaanbaatar, and so we had quite a good education, so we could use the opportunities that were given by this new system to get better education and to get better lives. But for example, if you look at people in some provincial centers in the countryside, more people, I think, are worse off there than better off. But I'm not talking about, again, political freedoms. I'm talking about just their normal daily life, how they, whether they have enough food or enough clothing, or whether they have good accommodation.
Well, as a member of the Mongolian parliament, what kind of government do you want to establish for the people, or what kind of government do you want for the Mongolian people?
For the Mongolian government, or for any future governments, I think I want a few things. I want them to be transparent. I want the Mongolian government to be accountable, and I want them to listen to people, or to get more participation from civil society or from private sector into their decision making. And it's not only for Mongolia. I understand that these are the main principles or demands for good government, because only then you can at least, you can't guarantee everything, but at least you can guarantee to a certain extent that power will not corrupt them. You know, power, as you know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And only by being transparent, open, and having some sort of accountability systems or monitoring systems and checks and balances from the outside the government, I think there is some sort of guarantee that the power will not be corrupted. And that's what I want from Mongolian government.
Do you think that the government in Mongolia is corrupt now? Do you think there's a lot of corruption?
There is, yes, there is a lot of corruption in government agencies, in banking system, in customs, in taxation system, and in government. But it's not only in Mongolia, it's in Russia and other also former Soviet Union countries. It's just a question how you go from here, and as I said previously, the transition period creates all these opportunities. And it's question now how to create those checking and balancing institutions, how to make the government more transparent, more accountable. And I mean, you have to take everything into context. For example, when I'm inside Mongolia, I say, oh God, everything is so bad, and things are getting more and more corrupt, and people are really worried about it. But when you take in a bigger context, like Central Asian countries, for example, or former Soviet Union, for example, results of Transparency International, which is an international NGO that conducts corruption index survey every year. Last year, Mongolia was 43rd out of 99 countries, one of the least corrupt being Scandinavian countries, and most corrupt being some of the former Soviet Union countries like Ukraine or other Central Asian countries. And I looked at other, in that corruption index, Mongolia is doing much better than any other former Soviet Union countries. excluding, for example, some Lithuania or Estonia, the Baltic republics. So if you take in a bigger context, we're probably not doing that bad. But I think because Mongolia is a big country but has a small population, and there is very easy access to decision makers, and just a few number of people make decisions. So I think we have to be much more careful than other countries with bigger population where there is more, I think, better check, I suppose. And because just a few really bad decisions can lead to disastrous consequences. And that's why I think we have to be much more careful.
Let me just I'm just going to blur your face a little bit.
Please tell us about your party. What does your party represent, and when was it formed?
Right. We formed our new political party in March 2000, this year, and we created it because we were really worried about how things were going in the Mongolian government and generally with the decision making. You know, the democratic leaders that were the democratic leaders that led Mongolia into democracy at the beginning of the 1990s, they were ruling the country, so we theoretically we should be happy. But I think, you know, one could lose a sense of, sorry, it's very difficult to answer. I'll start again. Okay, I'll make it very simple.
What are the primary
Okay.
goals of the party,
Right.
and why was it established? Tell us about your brother Zorig,
Mm-hmm.
and
Okay, fine.
yeah, his role in the party,
Mhm.
and also maybe tell us if you want
Right.
about this.
Okay.
What happened to him?
1, 2, 3.
Fine.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
We created our new party, Citizens' Will Party, in March year 2000, this year. And I have to give you a bit of background information to this. Until October 1998, I was happily working as a geologist for a mining company in London. And when I received shocking news that my brother was murdered, and so I flew back home, and there was a question of by-elections in his constituency afterwards. And of course I never thought of going for by-elections or anything then. And of course there was, it's very difficult to, I don't know whether I should just go, okay, no, I'll just make it very, very simple, Heather. I'll start again.
Okay.
Okay. We created a new political party, Citizens' Will Party, in March year 2000. And in order to give you an explanation why we created the party, I have to tell you a bit of the background information to this. Until October 1998, I was working happily as a geologist for a mining company in London when I received shocking news that my brother, Zorig, who was one of these pro-democracy leaders during the 1990s, and until 1998 he was heavily involved with politics. He was member of the parliament since 1990, and later on he became Minister for Infrastructure Development. And while he was at that post, Minister for Infrastructure Development and member of the parliament, he was brutally murdered in his own flat. And so I flew back home to Mongolia, and after a certain time of thinking, discussing with some friends and friends of my brother, I decided that I will go into politics and I will run in by-elections for his constituency. I won the by-elections then, and ever since my life has completely changed for me. While being in the parliament for a year and a half after the by-elections and after being in the politics, I started realizing that things in the Mongolian politics and things in the decision making are not going as well or as good as I thought they should. Okay.
Can you start that thought one more time, because we have street noise?
Right. Okay. During those year and a half that I was in the politics and the parliament, I realized, because I was very naive before going into politics, and I haven't lived in Mongolia for a number of years because I was working and doing research in England. When I came back, I realized that things in the Mongolian politics are not going as well as I was hoping for. And of course, there was a lot of changes of the government, of the democratic government, 4 governments in 4 years. Then my brother's murder wasn't solved, and there was a lot of cases of corruption, and generally political leaders deciding on various things just for their own benefit and not for the country's benefit. And that's not what we were hoping for, or that's not what we were expecting from the democratic leaders at the beginning of the 1990s. And it wasn't only my thinking. There were a lot of people outside the politics, very good people, achieved quite a bit in their own profession, and could have probably carried on with their lives as they were, but they weren't, because they weren't very happy with the decision making and generally with how the government was doing their job. There was a lot of dissatisfaction, and I decided that by creating a new political party, sorry, and well.